I can't really recall when I first became aware of teardrops and tiny travel trailers. It probably happened while surfing the web. The first one I ever saw in person looked a lot like this one. It was a fairly rough original example at an automotive swap meet. It lacked a galley, but the compactness really appealed to me. I dug deeper, researching the possibilities. When I ran across Andrew Gibbons' plans for a canoe carrying trailer, I was hooked. Since I'd be pulling it behind a small 4x4 and enjoying canoeing and kayaking, I felt that the boxy profile was more appropriate than a swoopy teardrop. I'll put a link to the plans in the description. Armed with the plans, I started taking inventory of the materials that I had on hand that were suitable for the project. Then, using the basic design from Mr. Gibbons, I roughed out some of the details. Unfortunately, I neglected to take any pictures during the early stages of the build. Rather than buy a Harbor Freight trailer frame, I welded up the 4-foot by 8-foot frame from 1.5 inch by 3/16 angle iron that I had on hand. In retrospect, it would have been much less troublesome to have purchased new 1.5 square tubing for the 4x8 frame. But I had a lot of leftover angle and decided to use it, doubling it to box the perimeter. Even with being extremely careful about not heating up the work too much, I had lots of warpage problems to deal with when I boxed in the sides. Nothing insurmountable, just a lot of unexpected work, all because I was dead set on using as much on-hand material as possible for the project. For an axle, I used a piece of 2x2 by 1/8 inch tubing. I machined 2 flanges for the ends to accept rear hub bearing assemblies from a junk Toyota Camry that I had. I ordered a pair of 1,500-pound springs and hangers from Northern Hydraulics and picked up some U-bolts at a local farm store. Since I intended to drag this thing off-road as well as on, I mounted the axle under the springs for maximum clearance. That also allowed the trailer to ride level without a drop hitch. I should note that in later years I put the axle on top of the springs to get it lower for pulling behind the lower vehicles that I've had since. It still has plenty of clearance. I originally planned to use a piece of marine glued plywood for the floor. That was until I priced ordering a sheet from the local building supply megastore. Not only was the cost prohibitive, being 600 plus miles from the nearest saltwater evidently makes marine plywood a special order only item. With an order of 1 sheet, I was looking at an 8 to 12 week wait. Time to back up and punt. I didn't think using an exposed sheet of treated plywood would be a good idea on the interior, so I topped the 1/2 inch sheet of treated plywood with a sheet of 1/4 inch Luan plywood to isolate the interior from the chemicals that could potentially emanate from it. I framed the walls with nominal 2x2s screwed and glued together with liquid nails, with the studs spaced to accommodate my door and windows salvaged from a junk Winnebago. I reinforced the corner joints with 1-inch angle brackets screwed and gorilla glued to the studs. My anchor bolts that attach the walls to the frame pass through these brackets as well. Each framed wall is sandwiched between 2 sheets of screwed and glued Luan, with the space between the studs filled with pieces of 1-inch styrofoam insulation. For the exterior skin, I chose to try out the fiberglass textured wallboard that was commonly used in bathrooms at the time. I planned to store my tiny travel trailer inside, so I wasn't too worried about the effects from UV exposure. Plus, I planned to keep it waxed with a good grade of automotive wax, which should have helped as well. Ironically, I think I've waxed it only once in the intervening 17 years. I glued the skin onto the 2 sidewalls before I attached them to the frame. I figured it'd be much easier to do horizontally than vertically. With the walls up, I attached the rafters and framed in the front wall. When work progressed to the rear hatch, progress slowed to a crawl. It was really time-consuming getting everything just right. For the seal around the galley hatch, I used some of the stuff that they put on the sides of overhead garage doors. It not only sealed well, but forms a gutter to drain the water off. I used more Luan and 2x2s to construct the interior cabinet. Originally, we had an AM/FM CD player in the upper middle of the cabinet with 2 speakers on each side, but we've since removed that. I also left a shelf in the middle and wired in a 12-volt accessory outlet, so if we happened to be camping in an urban area, we could watch a little portable TV. Later, we used a portable DVD player in that spot. Now we hang a tablet in front of the cabinet. I finished the interior wood with a couple of coats of spray-on clear polyurethane. The Luan's red hue contrasts nicely with the blonde pine trim we chose. I bought the corner trim for the exterior and the rainproof hinge for the galley from a now defunct company called Little Bear. They had excellent products and service too, but after 32 years in business, Grant retired. I tried some vinyl bathtub trim for the 3 horizontal seams. It looked great, but the attached adhesive turned loose on the first warm day. I finally had a friend bend custom angles from 2-inch wide aluminum, and they've worked fantastically. For the galley countertop, I had a neat stainless steel shelf that I cut to fit. I used a small stainless steel sink that was salvaged from a pop-up camper. I chose to use a common 7-gallon water jug for my supply tank. I carry an extra in the tow rig in case I run out before I get a place to refill. For a stove, I ended up using the burners out of a propane tabletop camp stove. I cut holes in the stainless steel countertop and mounted the camp stove burners under it with the controls accessible at the edge. After reading someone's idea of using the small disposable cylinders, I nixed the idea of mounting a bottle on the tongue. On our maiden voyage, we were gone 2 weeks and cooked at least 25 meals on one bottle, and it was still going strong. On a recent beach trip, we burned up 4 bottles in 3 days. Wind makes a huge difference in the amount of propane used. I got a deal on eBay for a roof vent with a 12-volt fan in it. For power, I chose a Group 31 deep cycle battery. I wanted as much reserve possible, and I mounted a small trickle charger to use when we have hookups at a camp. For a mattress, we started out with just a custom-made hypoallergenic one with 5 inches of cotton batting. Over the years, we've added foam mattress toppers both over and under it. I picked up a set of plain, round $12 fenders from the farm store, primed them and painted them with dark gray, hammer-tone Rust-Oleum paint, the same stuff that I also used on the frame, thinking it might withstand rock chips a little better than ordinary paint. I used off-the-shelf taillights and turn signals. All of my other electrical circuits are routed through an automotive-type fuse box mounted under the galley counter. Would I change anything if I had it to do over? Yeah, I would definitely add a second door. Now that we're older, we both have to get up in the night occasionally, and it's hard to climb out over or behind the other person. The main reason I only used one on this build was because I repurposed a rear hatch off of a motorhome that I junked out and cut it down to size. I probably never would have found the stuff to make a matching one for the other side. Our first night on the maiden voyage was spent in a tiny campsite beside a pond downwind of the Dodge City, Kansas stockyards. We then went on to the Colorado Rockies, Mesa Verde, and Utah. Unfortunately, I failed to take any pictures in New Mexico, Texas Panhandle, or Oklahoma on that trip. There were a lot of other trips after that where I failed to take any pictures of the camper. Here are a few more recent shots from 2022. Out of the barn and getting cleaned up for the first time in 7 or 8 years. Ready to head east. At a KOA in eastern Indiana. While reliving the history of our tiny trailer, I got the idea to start a map of its travels. As I mentioned before, our maiden voyage took us through Kansas, Colorado, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, across the Texas Panhandle, and Oklahoma before returning home to Missouri. The next several years, all of our trips with it were relatively short and close to home. By the end of 2022, we were able to resume long-distance travel and headed to eastern Pennsylvania to visit my last remaining uncle, who was too frail to attend my dad's funeral. Our return trip home through the Allegheny Mountains of Pennsylvania was timed perfectly for the fall color explosion. We took a side trip to Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water outside of Pittsburgh. In February 2024, we were tired of the Missouri winter weather and took off south through Arkansas to Texas and back home through Oklahoma. I made a slight effort to better document that journey, so look for a future video on that trip and how we travel on a shoestring budget when we want to get away but don't want to break the bank. When that video goes live, I will add a link to the description of this video. In the meantime, please like and subscribe, and I will continue to post a video every Friday. but not all of my content is travel related.